I'm Gary Gerstle, Vanderbilt University, Department of History, and today I have the opportunity to interview one of my colleagues, Devin Fergus, Assistant Professor of History, who focuses on the 20th century and has just completed his first book, Liberalism, Black Power, and the Making of American Politics, 1965 to 1980, which is going to be published in April 2009. Devin, thank you for agreeing to talk about your book with me.
A pleasure. A pleasure.
And I look forward to our conversation. The first question I want to ask you is this. We seem to be in the middle of a resurgence of interest in the Black Power movement in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. Could you talk a little bit about why that resurgence is happening now? And secondly, what is the relationship of your book to that resurgence? In other words, in this new Black Power literature, what is the specific or most important contribution of your book?
Sure. Part of the resurgence has to do with the contestations people have of the 1960s and the culture wars of the 60s. And Black Power is considered to be very much an outgrowth of that. And you have a new generation of young scholars who are coming of age and are interested in studying notions of identity and race and class to some sense, and studies of nationalism, especially in a sort of a post-Soviet age. And so I think this is a backdrop for the rise of interest in studies of nationalism more broadly, studies of Black Power in particular.
Does it also have something to do with a feeling that perhaps Martin Luther King and the so-called mainstream civil rights movement has been given too much credit for changes in the conditions of blacks and the struggle for racial equality? And is this part of a movement to question some of the orthodoxies about that and to rethink others who may have made contributions that are now in some respects ignored?
Sure, absolutely. And it's in part a counter-narrative to much of the King literature and scholarship and interest in King in a way to sort of broaden that argument. But in many ways, some of the recent scholarship, in particular, Pino Joseph's book, right? Some of the recent scholarship is about the continuity between the Civil Rights period and the Black Power period, about deperiodizing Black Power. So very much so about asserting the agency of Black Americans in ways in which they consider Martin King and arguments about the civil rights movement as sort of a deferential thing to larger issues of civil rights and nation. And so very much it's a counter-narrative in part to the King years and the arguments that King was the movement in and of itself, or as Stokely Carmichael would say, the Lord, because he was so embodied the movement. Mm-hmm. So absolutely. So
what is the most important contribution of your book to the rethinking of the civil rights movement and the struggle for racial equality and placing Black Power much more centrally in that story? What would you identify as the most important contribution of your book in that regard?
I would say first, I think the literature out there has been so influential in my own work and how I approach this period, and so my work in many ways builds upon the previous scholarship, but in particular my own unique contribution to the very important literature out there is it's twofold. First is it says that Black Power did not develop in isolation. Black Power as a larger instrument of nationalism more broadly remained engaged and had this interplay with liberalism. And much of the literature sort of elides that subject matter. Much of the specialist literature on Black Power elides that subject matter. So it's to reinsert Black Power into the broader narrative of American history. That's the broader aim of it, I had to say. And then by relocating that sort of sense, what does this tell us both about Black Power but also about liberalism more broadly? And that's the broader aim and objective of the book, relocating Black Power within a larger American narrative. And then by doing that, what does it tell us both about America as a whole, liberalism more specifically, as well as Black Power? So it's about reinserting Black Power within the narrative of the nation state in the United States, which I impart.
And once you reinsert Black Power into that major narrative, how do we see Black Power differently?
Sure. We see Black Power as an extension of civic nationalism in many ways. As an expression of civic nationalism in many ways. We see Black Power in its interplay, its intersectionality with liberalism more broadly. And Black Power is a more open movement than people have heretofore thought about it. And because Black Power is much more open than scholars and the general public have sort of looked at and perceived it, that openness means that it could also be modified or co-opted. If it could be engaged, it could be modified or co-opted. And also in this sort of sense, and in some levels, this is a project which is at some levels been informed by the Iraq War. I mean, we see the complexity in Iraq of trying to build a nation state. And that problem of how difficult it is, the Byzantine world of nation building. The Byzantine world of nation building by the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, the United States. And so if nation building is a difficult project in a space like Iraq, we can imagine what this project of institution building or nation building for these Black Power activists, how difficult that project was for them, and the practical questions they had to address. In the efforts to build a nation, or at least first to imagine a nation, and then to the practicality of building one. And so in that sense, the things like efforts to build a nation, to rebuild a nation in Iraq is some levels sort of informed my project on Black Power.
So do you view Black Power as less revolutionary than some others have written, or do you think that at certain points it was revolutionary, but at other points it made accommodations to liberalism? How do you?
Yes is the answer, Gary.
Okay.
All of the above. I mean, Black Power exists on a continuum, like in many ways, like nationalism does, and so there were Black Power groups which were very revolutionary. The Black Panther Party, for instance, was considered to be a sort of revolutionary organization. And that group was modified in many ways, and there were Black Power organizations which were a bit more mild or moderate in their original political agenda. And the classic example might be something like Soul City. But wherever you would plot Black Power on the continuum from a modified agenda to a revolutionary one, wherever you plot on the continuum, all of it engaged liberalism at some level. It existed and functioned in the context of this golden age of liberalism, which is basically 1930s through early 1970s. So, and that's the context in which we find Black Power located and existing.
Mm-hmm. And now, most of your book focuses on North Carolina, and consists of a series of very rich case studies of Black Power activities, struggles in North Carolina. Could you tell us first why you chose North Carolina as opposed to some other state? What drew you to that? And then also perhaps give an example or two of Black Power in action in North Carolina that would illustrate for us the way in which Black Power, as you suggested so well, operates along this continuum. But first tell us what drew you to North Carolina.
I could imagine the response if I had done a study of liberalism and Black Power in New York or San Francisco.
Or Oakland.
Or Oakland, exactly, in those sorts of spaces. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to look at Black Power in a space we might not first initially imagine it, North Carolina. So that's part of it. North Carolina existed as it's known as a progressive southern state, and it also existed as an epicenter for the Black Power movement. And so if I want to make the point that if we can illustrate or demonstrate the rise of institutional Black Power in a place like North Carolina, and I think operative word is institutional. Black Power was about nation building, so it challenges notions of Black Power as nihilistic, as about utter destruction. So, if you demonstrate the institutional rise of Black Power in North Carolina, we can demonstrate it there. The implication would be, of course, we can imagine it in more progressive spaces, like in Oakland, like New York, like a Boston, like a Chicago. So if we can imagine Black Power in more conservative spaces like North Carolina, of course we can imagine it existing in other more progressive ones.